The US can't just be the research leader. You can't publish some research and decide to put it on a shelf and have it not go anywhere. That's one of the major things driving the CHIPS and Science Act. We've got to stop thinking about manufacturing as not being a research endeavor.
The way that we made more and more powerful chips is to put more transistors onto the chip. And we can put more transistors on the chip because the transistors keep getting smaller and smaller. Now they're not getting smaller at the same pace as they used to. So to make more and more powerful chips, we need more chips, but we need them to act like one chip. We need to put all these transistors all together. And the way that you do that falls under this umbrella term, advanced packaging. And it really is sort of the next big wave of innovation and keeping pace with, the needs of technology.
Hi, my name is Junko Yoshida. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Ojo-Yoshida report. We have been very interested in what's going on with the Department of Commerce on CHIPS and Science Act. And we've done interviews with the investment teams on the chips manufacturing portion. And here we are today. We're going to talk about science part of the CHIPS and Science Act. And we have two important guests today, both from Department of Commerce. First, let me introduce Dr. Jay Lewis. He's the Director of National Semiconductor Technology Center. Hi, Jay. How are you?
Doing great. Great to be here, and thanks for having me.
All right. And we have another guest. His name is Richard-Duane Chambers. He is the Director of Policy and Integration. Again, this is the R&D program portion of CHIPS Act. Hi, Richard-Duane.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we start the conversation, I thought it's best if each of you can briefly describe who you are, where you're coming from, because when we write about CHIPS and Science Act, the problem we have is that we always have this Department of Commerce in the headline, but we don't really see the people behind it. And you're the two important people behind the curtain. So, Jay, let's start with you. I mean, tell us a little bit of who you are.
Yeah, thank you. And if you don't mind, I'll tell you a little bit about my background, but also a little bit about why I'm here, because I think these two things are really the same story. My background is material science. My training education was PhD in material science, and I spent about the first 15 years of my career doing research in the lab, working on government-funded programs, writing proposals, going to conferences, that kind of thing. And the science and the research part was really my formative part of my career. And then I had the chance to go to a place called DARPA. And some of your listeners may know DARPA. In case they don't, this is sort of a wacky idea part of the Department of Defense and, trying bold and innovative things. And this was always a little bit of a dream job for me. It was a place to, be part of, where I thought, some real innovation was happening. So I spent about 6 years in the government in DARPA. And part of that time I was in the microelectronics office and really got deeply invested in just the mission, like the national challenges, national policy challenges, technology challenges, and, some of the concerns really with how deeply critical semiconductors were to the country, to society, to the economy. And so when I left DARPA, I spent about 4 years at Microsoft and working with their semiconductor efforts. And these were pre-COVID years, and so this was before supply chain disruptions, and you really had to start most conversations by explaining to people why semiconductors were important and why they should care. And it's really amazing how much things have changed, and so that really led to this beginning of these CHIPS R&D efforts and the chance to come be part of the creation of some of these programs. And I really felt like my background in sort of not just experience, but really, appreciation for innovation in R&D, government programs and the government role, and some of the industry challenges really sort of all came together. So I joined the Commerce Department about a year ago in this role.
Okay, a year ago. Okay, so it's still new.
Still new.
All right, very good. So I'm going to go to the Richard-Duane. Tell us about your story.
Sure thing. So, as you said, I'm now the Director for Policy and Integration here within the CHIPS Research and Development Office. I would say that maybe my guiding light so far has been to ensure that the United States maximizes its technology leadership and that those technologies benefit the American people. It's led me to a lot of different places. So my background is actually in aeronautics and astronautics. Decided to take a tour into policy and found myself on Capitol Hill doing oversight of agencies like the National Science Foundation and NASA, working to get them funded. Had the good fortune of going to DARPA, which was my turn into the semiconductor space, working for Jay and a great leader named Bill Chappell, helping to launch what we called then the Electronics Resurgence Initiative, really recognizing that as the arc of electronics was changing, that meant our competitors had a chance to catch up, and the United States really needed to focus on what it was good at to have a lead. I got a call after I'd done that for a couple of years saying, we're going to get this thing done called the Endless Frontier Act. We're going to try to set up a DARPA at the National Science Foundation, and we're going to try to put money towards the United States investment in chips. And probably my first thought was, what? You're not going to pull all of that off? But sure, I'll take on the challenge. Maybe my second guiding light is to say I gravitate towards the challenge even when I think that, man, I'm really tired and I need a rest. So that allowed me to be one of the lead negotiators in the Senate in getting the CHIPS and Science Act passed. Was very tired at the end of that, thought I should go and take a break. And I got a call saying, hey, would you like to come and help stand up this new office? It's totally ready. Everything's good to go. And a year later, we are still moving as fast as we possibly can to live up to the promise of the CHIPS and Science Act.
If I could say, I've known Richard-Duane for about 10 years, and it's true, he doesn't rest.
He doesn't rest. Okay. No sleep for Richard-Duane. All right. One of the things that occurred to me is that I have been writing about electronics for a long time. And DARPA always comes up as really the kind of foundational research development the United States actually led the world. Now from DARPA to Department of Commerce, how do you see this program of Department of Commerce actually position itself different from the role DARPA has played over decades?
I can jump in for a second and let Jay answer the DARPA piece more directly. I think what I love pointing out to people when they look at this industry, this is one of the most research intensive industries in the world, right? When it started, though, the government had a big role. You look at the 1960s and the Apollo program taking 60% of the sales, right? Forcing the industry to get better. You're right. DARPA has played this huge role from, I think 193 nanometer lithography came out of DARPA, the FinFETs investment. But what people maybe don't understand is that NIST has also played a role, even during that period, as a partner to DARPA. I think even before the DARPA period, like in the late 70s, NIST was developing the metrology and partnering with industry to figure out how to just make sure that these increasingly small features, that we could measure them. Even today, we've got facilities to help industry to figure out how to work with EUV lithography. So there's a lot of good history here. What I think is new and different that the Department of Commerce can do, DARPA will still have a role. The DoD still plays a major role. They were funded significantly under the CHIPS and Science Act. But Commerce has a long history of working with industry, in partnership with industry, inviting them into our labs, inviting them to bring their problems. We do that in the cybersecurity space. You see us as leaders now in the artificial intelligence space and in quantum. So I think we really have an opportunity to partner with industry in a way that, maybe is a little different than what they've seen in the Department of Defense, but bringing in as well a lot of that really good knowledge and power from DoD, DARPA led the way on, in my opinion, figuring out how they're going to work with companies like Intel, et cetera. So there's still a lot of work that we can do together. DARPA's got to stay focused on its foundational mission of national security. We get to bring in a mission of economic security, and that's where I talk about making sure the technologies we invest in benefit the American people.
Can you explain further, how DARPA, you said earlier on that DARPA has a significant portion in the CHIPS Act, right? How is that integrated with the DOC's job?
So two things. DARPA did not individually get funding under the CHIPS Act. The DoD got funding under the CHIPS Act, so that's the Microelectronics Commons. They are funding a number of I regret of commons. I try to not use the word hubs too often around the country. That's really good university-led research that's going to get passed off to these core centers that can build them really all around the DoD mission. DARPA, however, because of the Electronics Research Initiative work that Jay helped to launch all those years ago, is continuing to grow that portfolio. Again, focused on DoD relevant technology. So, for instance, one of their major announcements in less than the last 6 months was NGMM. That's looking at the advanced packaging world and 3D heterogeneous integration and building out those facilities for that. So we're taking pieces of it across the government. And then what we have to do is we've got to work together and say, really good ideas are going to come out of Jay's NSTC. And what pieces of those may have to be handed off to the DoD? I think a lot of times, or to NGMM, I think a lot of times you're going to see really good ideas coming out of the DoD, actually. And they're going to be going to Jay's program at the NSTC and saying, I need a place to test this. I need a place to do the lab to fab. And that's an offer that we are going to bring to the table.
Yeah, if I could build on that just a little bit, I think it's useful to actually just think about sort of the mission and purpose of each of those entities. And I think having been at DARPA and understanding that is really helpful in designing what we want these programs to be and how we want them to work. The mission of DARPA really is disruption. It's, creating and preventing strategic surprise has always been sort of the mission, but it's through disruption. And that is one of the things that makes DARPA great is that is their real focus, is the disruptive piece. It's not long-term extended investments to carry something all the way through to maturity. DARPA does fixed short-term programs to show what's possible and then let people take those things on. One of the things that I think has been a gap in the sort of U.S. federal funding ecosystem is what we are trying to fill, which is really explicitly focusing on the semiconductor industry and making sure that we have the culture, the people, and the infrastructure for innovation, and making sure that those things lead to manufacturing and commercial enterprise for successful companies over the long term. And so we're actually trying to fill a different gap, and that's why we're actually designing a bit of a different organization than DARPA. But I agree with Richard-Duane. These things are very complementary, and we hope, I think, I'm very optimistic that a lot of these disruptive innovations will be things that we can then actually show impact through a commercial ecosystem.
Let me just say one thing. We just actually brought over the DARPA lead for NGMM over here. So it's Next Generation Microelectronics Manufacturing. That's an M that I should never forget.
All right. Very good. Okay. So let's get to the, I'm really glad that we bridged the what DARPA is responsible for. And in fact, actually, Department of Commerce is bridging between the fundamental research being already done somewhere to the industry, is it not? Is that the good way to describe it? You guys are the bridge?
I think that's a very good way to describe it. And I think you mentioned the phrase a bit ago, this lab to fab transition. And one of the things that is not unique to semiconductors, but I think substantially more difficult in semiconductors than most other technologies, is how hard and how expensive and how long it can take for a new idea to really make an impact in state-of-the-art, high-volume manufacturing. And so that's really what this term tries to capture. Going from lab to fab is incredibly difficult, and as technology gets more complex, that gap grows and becomes harder and more expensive to bridge. And so one of the things that we are trying to do across CHIPS R&D, and including within the NSTC program, is not just technology leadership and building on these innovations, but lowering the barriers. So lowering the time, reducing the time, and reducing the cost of bringing new technologies to market. So we want to, by doing that, we really think that we can facilitate and enable innovation across the country, across the ecosystem, and just have really a more thriving, piece of that, piece of the industry, and make sure that that's happening here in the U.S.
All right, very good. Now, my understanding is that this R&D portion of the CHIPS Act or this CHIPS program actually have four pillars or four programs. Can either one of you, give us a list and what they are?
I'll let you take that one, Richard-Duane.
I was going to let you go with it. So the centerpiece of this is really Jay Zephyr at the National Semiconductor Technology Center. I will let him talk about that in greater depth, and maybe I'll spend some time talking about the other threes. So one of them is the metrology program led by a fantastic leader, Dr. Marla Dowell. As I said, this is NIST's bread and butter, thinking about how do we measure things better, what are the standards going to be. That program, and I should say they started working even before the CHIPS and Science Act passed, because it was just NIST standard remit. Went about identifying critical metrology challenges, like what are the things we have to measure better to be successful. And those can be things like on the EUV side, to how do I increase yield, to how do I increase the security of the chips that I get. As a matter of fact, they've been putting money towards investigating advanced metrology for EUV. On the other one, and they're actually, I should point out, they've really taken the lead as well on identifying that there are a lot of small businesses out here in this field that want to jump in. It's not an easy time to be a small business in semiconductors. It never was. It can be hard to get venture capital funding. So they launched an SBIR program as well. Our hope was to put out up to $54 million for small businesses wanting to do cool metrology work in the United States. So that solicitation is closed. I know they're in review now. One of our other programs, led by Dr. Dev Palmer, that's the National Advanced Packaging Manufacturing Program. I'll tell you, one of the things that we talked about on the Hill was that there's always a challenge and there's always an opportunity. We know that when it comes to building chips, the U.S. was 37% of the global market in the 1990s. We had fallen by the time this bill passed to about 12%. We were on a path potentially to 10%, and we weren't doing any of the leading edge chips. So we were worried about not building it. But then there's the worry. You build the chip, now you've got to package it, turn it into something useful. Guess what? That's that chip going all around the world. And if you believe, as many of us do, that advanced packaging is not only about putting the chips together, but the future of performance, it was problematic because you saw the US only had maybe 3% of packaging and no real good advanced packaging to make that done. So we've said we're going to put about $2 billion into changing that dynamic, making sure that there's good research for advanced packaging here in the United States, hoping that the CPO side means that you'll have manufacturing for advanced packaging and research all in the same country. We've announced our first notice of funding opportunity for that, about $300 million. And I think we've announced that we're down to about 8 teams competing for that 300. But another funding opportunity is on the way, $1.6 billion. Then the third one, this is the Manufacturing USA program. Some of your listeners may have heard about this. This has been at least a decade now. I forget the exact number, maybe almost 19 Manufacturing USA institutes stood up around the country. And these are really collaborations between industry, between universities, in some cases between labor, to figure out how do you manufacture things better in this country, usually in the $70 million federal investment range with one-to-one match. Well, we wanted to go big, go bold, go even better than what we've gotten returns on this. So we've said that we were going to put $285 million into a single manufacturing USA institute. We're looking for one-to-one or better than one-to-one cost share and co-investment. I think at one point, we put in some much more aggressive numbers, really asking industry to come to the table. But what I think we did that was really different was we said, we want this Manufacturing USA Institute, rather than thinking of itself as an opportunity to fund a lot of small projects, I want you to come and tell us the big problem you are going to solve for industry when everyone gets together. Still a lot of small projects, still a lot of training, but figure out how to solve a big problem. And we asked them to focus on digital twins, how you are going to use a digital manifestation of the physical world to improve manufacturing. And our hope is that you'll see you get a much more disaggregated model using digital, a lot more players coming in. And when you look at something like putting a new material into the chip ecosystem, we have reports saying it can take 25 years. When you think about putting a new equipment in, years and years and years. So if I can do it digitally, can I expedite that and have the US just move that much faster? So that's the promise of that. $285 million. And I should say fantastic responses to these. I think in the first webinar for Manufacturing USA, for the first webinar for NAPMP, over 800 people signed up. And that's just the webinar, right? That's not even the funding opportunity. That's the webinar. And I think they're down to about 3 teams now competing to cross the finish line. So those are the 3. I'll let Jay tell you about the centerpiece.
Sorry, Richard, if I may just have you expand on that. When you talk about manufacturing, when people talk normally about manufacturing, we don't typically look at the research side. We don't look at advanced processes and things like that. This is fascinating stuff. Who came up with this idea? Why did you decide that this was that important?
Well, I will say this. The Manufacturing USA portion was part of the legislative requirements of the bill. But let me tell you why I think we embraced it. There has been a lot of scholarship over time with people knocking on the door saying the US can't just be the research leader. You can't publish some research and decide to put it on a shelf and have it not go anywhere. That's one of the major things driving the Chips and Science Act. And we can talk about some of the policies that we're implementing here. But in addition to that scholarship was this idea that we've got to stop thinking about manufacturing as not being a research endeavor, that you can do research into improving manufacturing. As a matter of fact, I think the Japanese taught us quite well in the 1980s that manufacturing can't be static, it's got to be dynamic, it's got to be innovative. And the US hasn't put enough time and thought into making that happen. So that really is one of the reasons why we bought into this idea of Manufacturing USA. We're not just figuring out how to invent the next piece of technology. We're figuring out how to invent it and then to build it cheaper, more efficiently, right here in the United States. Otherwise, we'll come up with the future. I guarantee you, the United States will continue to come up with the future. Somebody else will figure out how to build it. And that's not the place that we need to end up.
Yeah, if I could build on that just a little bit, if I had to name my 2 favorite parts of the Chips and Science Act, one of them is exactly what Richard-Duane was just describing. So the fact that it simultaneously prioritized both manufacturing and research. For people who maybe are following, some of the corporate moves and things like that, but maybe not so much the underlying technology, one of the things that I think is important to understand is that I think what we're doing with manufacturing incentives is amazing. And I guess hopefully anybody listening to this has already heard your conversations about the manufacturing incentives. But when you build a manufacturing capability for semiconductors, in about 5 years, it is out of date. So if you are not constantly developing the next technology and deploying that next technology and deploying new manufacturing, you're falling behind. Just by standing still, you're falling behind and falling behind very quickly in this field. So by pairing both research and making sure that we have a robust innovation ecosystem together with manufacturing incentives was, I think, absolutely critical for the long-term success and impact that this bill can have. And if I could point out one other thing, because Richard-Duane talked a little bit about some of these other programs, one of the things that I really want to highlight, especially if you're not sort of in the weeds in this technology area, is the specific funding and focus on advanced packaging. So this is, traditionally you build a chip, which is a very, very, very complicated thing to do. And then you put it into a package that has, wires and things and lets it talk to the world. And we've been doing that for, 50, 60 years, as long as we've had a semiconductor industry. One of the things that is happening really and accelerating over the last 10 years is that, the way that we made more and more powerful chips is to put more transistors onto the chip. And we can put more transistors on the chip because the transistors keep getting smaller and smaller. Now they're not getting smaller at the same pace as they used to. So to make more and more powerful chips, we need more chips, but we need them to act like one chip. We need to put all these transistors all together. And the way that you do that falls under this umbrella term, advanced packaging. And so you're either putting things very close together side by side, maybe you're putting one on top of the other. And it really is sort of the next big wave of innovation and keeping pace with, the needs of technology. And so making sure that there was specific funding to make sure that, that innovation was happening in the U.S. was, I think, a really critical and very insightful part of the design of this act. And so we really are trying to make sure that the NSTC, which covers sort of other things in semiconductor innovation, and this advanced packaging program, as well as digital twins and metrology, are all working together, to complement one another and be, sort of greater than they would be individually. And so really just making sure that these different pieces were all baked in, I think is one of the things that will make this successful in the long term.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Jay, I want you to go into the NSTC portion, but before we get there, what you just said about advanced packaging, this is what we are hearing about things like chiplets, right? And the idea of chiplets have been going on in DARPA for a long time, and that was their way of circumvent the problem of how far can you go with the higher integration? Why don't we actually make this packaging to, as you said, act all these little layers as one chip, right? My question then is that as we cover the industry, a lot of key players are working on their own in terms of they want to get ahead in certain elements of chiplets, for example. Take an example of chiplets, right? So how do you guys work with industry that some players are doing their own thing, which is great, but at the same time, how can your advanced packaging program help them?
Yeah, no, I love that question because that's it's not obvious like how these two things might work together. One of the things that I think is also important to point out is the time that it takes to invest in a new technology before it can go into production. I mentioned that earlier. In this community, people might think about software and taking a few months or maybe a year or two to develop some new product. In semiconductors, it typically takes it can be at 10 years, 15 years before a new idea actually gets into volume production. And so the R&D budgets for semiconductor companies, and Richard-Duane mentioned this earlier, it is a very highly research-intensive industry. So any company, any semiconductor company that is halfway serious is constantly investing in research, and that is great. And U.S. companies are quite good at that and have a great track record. And so we're not trying to replace that. What we are actually trying to do, that research is becoming more and more expensive and harder for an individual company to be able to take a technology all the way through. And we hear over and over again that what is really needed, and one of the gaps is like, hey, we know what we're going to do in the next 5 years or so. It's getting harder and harder to see what is going to be the real innovation that matters 5 to 10 years from now. And having something like an NSTC or an NAPMP for, semiconductor technology, packaging technology that can help sort of lower that risk, help sort of crowdsource some of that innovation, funding, and help them see where are the best bets for them to make for the next 5 to 7 years is really the gap that we're trying to fill. So we're not trying to be the new physics, 20-year science project. And we're not trying to replace the 3 to 5 year investments that are already being funded by these companies. It's this gap in the middle that we really think we can make all of these companies more successful and help them at what they do best.
Talking about packaging, Jay, it has become a competitive weapon in this industry. Companies now focus on advanced packaging to distinguish themselves. And so I wonder then how you make sure money provided and programs introduced by the US government benefits everybody. How do you ensure that?
Yeah, that is a tough problem. So, we need to have a good balance of making sure that companies still have sort of a competitive advantage, competitive motivation. We don't want to get in the way of companies being able to compete. But you raise a great point. When federal dollars are used, we don't just want to, pay a particular company's research team to do something that they do best. That will specifically benefit them over some other U.S. company. And so I think the way that we can do that and what we're focusing on is this area of what we call pre-competitive research. So it's, funding and focusing on these areas where companies are actually willing to maybe not work together, but, work side by side alongside one another and partner to some degree to just, again, sort of reduce this risk. And then, that technology is then available to any of those companies that are participating.
Very good. So, Richard-Duane actually described the 3 programs out of 4, and the key one that's left for Jay to describe to us is NSTC. Can you explain that?
It's my favorite subject. Absolutely. So, yeah, NSTC is formally what we call a private-public consortium. So it is an organization that is meant to be composed and really bring together multiple communities. Some of the biggest ones that we think about are industry, academia, and government agencies, and sort of bring them together and help make sure that we're making the right investments to strengthen sort of the research ecosystem overall. So I'll talk about 3 really specific goals that we have. And under each one of these goals, I could talk for, hours about what we're doing within each of those buckets, and I won't. But sort of the 3 buckets that we really talk about are technology leadership. So making sure that we are taking advantage of these new ideas, these new technology opportunities, that we're doing that in this country, and that U.S. companies are able to innovate and are continuing to sort of maintain that leadership in universities as well. The second topic really gets back to this challenge of taking things from lab to fab. And so the second thing that we're trying to do is lowering barriers to innovation. And so this isn't always investing in a specific technology, so to speak. It's investing in new capabilities that can be shared across academia or industry. So it might be, tools to design chips more efficiently. places that you can go test your prototype without having to pay sort of the full cost of building that infrastructure yourself. It might be getting access to some advanced technology where, a lot of times the most advanced technologies are really only available to the biggest companies. So can we unlock some doors through these programs to enable small businesses, universities to innovate and be part of that innovation cycle? And then the third thing that we're doing, and this third thing is, to be clear, is being done across all of CHIPS R&D as well as CHIPS incentives, is workforce development. And Richard-Duane and his team are actually spending a lot of time on this as well. And it's just making sure, from technicians and tool operators to PhDs and, the next generations of scientists and engineers, the only way that we can continue this innovation cycle is if we have the people and the talent. And so through all of our programs, we're trying to develop those things. So the NSTC, and let me make sure I point out one other very important part of that. Many government-funded programs have, a government program manager, who essentially takes money and we sort of decide what's going to be done with it, and then they, through some competition, fund directly companies, researchers, universities, or something like that. We have this consortium, and so this consortium has an operator. So this is a new nonprofit company called NatCast. Go check out natcast.org, please, to learn more about them. So they are the operator of the NSTC. And so, what we are really doing is, is have this entity with some amazing leadership, amazing people, and they're hiring and building this really impressive, talented group, and empowering them to have these direct relationships with universities, with industry, with us, the government as well, and execute these programs. And so, so that's, in a nutshell, the NSTC has a pretty broad mandate. It's, really across a wide range of semiconductor technologies, also a very wide range of stakeholders. And so we really are trying to establish this as a program that will be enduring. As I've mentioned many times, these things take a long time. For the NSTC to really have the impact that it needs to have, it needs to be around to see these things through. So that's what we're trying to build.
Okay, so it needs to be around for a long time, right? And when we talked about the investment team of the CHIPS Act, my question was how long this program is supposed to last? And the answer was, it depends, but it's going all the way up to 2030. 2030 doesn't seems to be such a long term, when you look at the semiconductor industry. So how do you describe your program to last for how long, and how do you fund yourself?
Yeah, one of the things that we are trying to do is to make sure that we build partnerships and add value so that we can actually bring in not just federal dollars, but also private investments through membership fees, through usage fees, through collaborative research programs, and so there are models for doing this kind of industry collaborative programs, and so it absolutely must have this kickstart of federal funding to get going, and but the goal is that over time, the amount of federal funding that is needed to sustain it decreases over time. As we build a history, build track record, show impact, show results, delivering those results to industry partners, university partners, so that it becomes more sustainable.
How are companies, on the private side, how are companies engaging with these, and what's been the response so far that you've seen? And which areas of focus do you think they are mostly interested in?
So we are actually planning to roll out our membership campaign in about the next month or two. So let's check back in a few months. I'll tell you how it's going. But I will say we've been having lots of conversations with companies really since my time over the last year, and we just consistently hear affirming feedback about the need for this, and so we're very excited about the engagement. But this is a long-term investment, so we are really just getting off the ground, and I think, like I said, I'm very optimistic and excited. And I think if we do this well, this is going to be something that industry will say, yeah, we can't go back. We can't live without it.
I'll also say, when you look at some of our other programs, the level of interest that we're seeing in the packaging program in Manufacturing USA, there are company after company that are looking at this as a major opportunity for them. So I think you'll see the same thing in the NSTC. And, I'd like to, if you don't mind, you'd asked a question earlier about, well, geez, when you go and invest in a company, how do you make sure that that delivers benefit that's not just for that company? And I think one of the great things that we are enabled to do here is we ask, right? There has been, looking at the history, there is such a rich history of the United States helping to make some formative investments. And then the government, then the private sector takes it off. You can go and look, Google, Sergey Brin had initial federal funding, Qualcomm, initial funding from the National Science Foundation. I think that we're very likely to see some of those same things here. But what we do is we go and we say to companies, we want the IP to stay in the United States for some certain amount of time. It's something that, quite frankly, we learned from our DARPA fellows, right? We want you to come and tell us, is there a commercialization plan that will involve, manufacturing in the United States? And you can take that sort of broader look at what it means to benefit the American people. We've put in on, if you look at the chip side, $39 billion in investment has aggregated to over $300 billion of private sector investment. I think it's over 100,000 jobs promised. Like, those are all benefits that even when you give to a direct company, everyone is going to see the benefit of that. And the reason I wanted to foot stop it was such a big discussion point in Congress, right? A lot of people ask, why would you give money to these companies? And the answers ended up being relatively simple. We got a wake-up call, like national security. We saw what it looked like when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we said, you don't have access to chips any longer. And you see Russia trying to pull chips out of like washing machines. Like, okay, big benefit by investing in companies on the national security side. Economic security. We saw during COVID, I remember Janet Yellen testifying, and I believe she had said something along the lines of used car prices went up 30%, a huge driver of core inflation. And the reason used car prices are up is because we can't get chips, right? So there was an economic security imperative. We're investing in these companies because it's better from the economic security perspective. And the third piece was like, listen, this is jobs. This is foundational to everything that we do. This is foundational on the pharmaceutical side. So I think you're going to see that even when you put money into a specific company or a set of companies, there are a lot of different mechanisms by which everyone is going to benefit. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I say to that company, like, hey, you've got to give everyone your IP right now. You're going to be in the we're going to be in the pre-competitive space. But sometimes we're going to have to look at them and say, you know what? I actually go ahead, run with it. You've shown us how you're going to deliver. I don't need to live in a world where you share that with everyone. And as a matter of fact, we learned this from our DARPA days. Sometimes it's better to live in a world where you didn't share that with everyone, because that's how the United States keeps its lead.
Interesting. So the one of the things that actually, this is a pull back a lens a little bit. The United States government has invested a lot of money for various R&D programs so far. How is this specific CHIPS Act R&D program different? I think we might have heard some answers, but can you put in a broader brushstroke, how is it different?
I'm not sure that we have seen anything of this scale and this level of focus in a technology industry probably since Apollo. Somebody could tell me I'm wrong. Probably the only thing that competes is things like the cancer moonshot. We've done things like this on the biotech side, but in this type of technology, I'm not sure that we've seen anything quite like this because we've never had a wake-up call quite like this.
I would also, I agree with that. I would also say that most federal funding for research is either very basic research, the kinds of things that NSF does, or it is mission-driven research. So things that are funded by DoD or DOE or NIH for a very specific end use and application. And one of the things that is different, and one of the things that I think makes this just an amazing opportunity, is this program is focused on a technology sector that we know is a strategic imperative for the country. And it's meant for the good and the health of that sector and that technology in the U.S., which really is a unique mission and a unique charter among sort of federal science and federal R&D programs, which is a lot of why we are trying to ask fundamental questions about we don't necessarily need to do things the same way they've been done before. What is the best way to achieve this mission? And so in some ways, we are sort of breaking ground on some new models to do that.
You've kind of laid out some very interesting concepts and ideas, and I see it running from academia to the private sector and public-private sector partnerships and all that. So you have academic research, you have long-term focus, you have short-term. You still have a limited amount of money that you have to manage. So how do you rate which area to look at first? I mean, and which one is going to get, do we have an idea of which segment, academia or?
I don't have the perfect answer for you, but I can say this. We talked about those 800 people showing up at our events. We talked about the metrology program starting to engage with the community even before this passed. We've done maybe 25 different events to talk to the community and put out RFIs, et cetera. So there really has been a long process and brought in these really smart people of trying to think about where we can have the biggest bang for our buck. And then it's a competition. Right? Then we put out competitive NOFOs and we say, who comes and gives us the best answers in the area that we are focused on? And that area, as Jay said, you're not going to see as much from on us on the early research side. And I go and tell some universities that, and I'm sure they look at me the wrong way, right? And we're not going to put all of our money into something that the commercial sector can just do on its own. We're bridging that gap. So I think it's the combination of that clarity, knowing that we are bridging the gap where we want to be, bringing really smart people, listening to the community, and then it's a competition. That'll decide how the money splits out.
If I could add one thing that's just a little bit of a philosophical layer on top of that, completely agree with Richard-Duane's answer. And I think frequently what you will see is that the best answer is actually bringing multiple communities and multiple types of stakeholders to help solve these problems. It is an incredibly complex landscape. Industry is good at some things. University is good at different things. As we've talked about, we are actually trying to get better at bridging that gap. Those communities don't often work well together or communicate well together. And it's not because they're not trying. They just live in different worlds and kind of speak a different language. And one of the things that I think we hope we can do is actually, have focused programs and even places where people work together, collaborate, and actually get better at having, university ecosystem working, talking, and partnering with industry to make us just better at doing this overall. And so, I think just by nature of the competition that Richard-Duane said, I think a lot of times what you will see is that the answer is partnering.
Jay, I wish I'd had the smarts to give that answer because it's perfect. And nearly in all of our NOFOs, we talk about partnership. And I had somebody say this to me at one point, a senator, about the CHIPS and Science Act. Like, the word of the day now coming out of the CHIPS and Science Act, coming out of many other bills out of Congress. If you look at the Department of Energy and their work, it's partnership. it's not the individual hero any longer. It's really bringing together a group of people. You're absolutely right.
Speaking of which, partnership. The semiconductor industry is essentially, in essence, is a very global industry, right? And R&D program also involves, I think it should have some kind of partnership with the partners abroad. For example, like, I don't know, other countries has its own, whether it's IMEC or Fraunhofer or CEA Leti, each company has its own champion R&D center. So how do you work with the foreign partners within the context of CHIPS R&D program?
Well, I'll say that on multiple fields, we are reaching out. We're having active discussions. I think very early on, even Jay, I think, had to sit down and go and meet some of his Japanese counterparts. It's great to see the level of interest that we're getting globally. And then we've tried to say that in our no flows as well, that we want to be a welcoming place for all of our allies and partners. But we're going to go in with the understanding, just as our companies would go over there, they're going to go in with the understanding that the United States is putting in dollars because we're lifting up the United States, and we're hoping that everyone else will be coming with us. So I do hope that you'll see when we start making these awards that there are a lot of partners with us, and you're already seeing that on the CPO side with the list of companies that are coming to the United States, regardless of where their home base is.
The current administration is slowly getting on its way out. So we wonder then, the research part of the CHIPS Act, how do you ensure continuity?
So I will say this: I had the pleasure of sitting on the Senate floor as as the votes were counted for the CHIPS and Science Act, and we really got to a place where this was a bipartisan bill. The first CHIPS Act actually passed under another administration, and this administration, on a bipartisan basis, getting the funding across the finish line. So I remain confident that this is going to continue being a bipartisan issue.
All right. Very good, gentlemen. Thank you so much for participating in this panel. We really learned a lot, but I think we're going to keep track of what you guys are doing and tell us more as things develop.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.